Starfleet's greatest achievement was not the invention of the warp drive or the defeat of the Borg at Wolf 359's terrible cost. It was the quiet, persistent belief that everything could eventually be understood, categorized, and explained. That belief died briefly, and spectacularly, on stardate 77432.6, when every telepathic mind within 40 light-years of the Romulan Free State's outer border simultaneously lost consciousness. On Vulcan, 17 mediating scholars collapsed mid-sentence in the halls of ancient thought. In the Beta's embassy on Earth, Ambassador Troy Riker's entire diplomatic staff crumpled to the floor as though struck by a single, invisible fist. Aboard a passing Starfleet medical transport near the neutral zone's ghost boundary, a Beta's nurse named Sela Oren described it afterward as hearing a choir composed of 10,000 voices, all singing in a frequency the humanoid brain was never designed to process. She was one of the fortunate ones. She woke up. The cause registered on long-range sensors as a subspace fold, a collapse of dimensional membranes at a specific coordinate 2.3 light-years inside former Romulan space, in a region already destabilized by the cascading aftershocks of the supernova that had shattered an empire. Romulan salvage teams had been working that corridor for months, threading experimental temporal recovery technology through the wreckage of dead worlds, desperately fishing for anything that might restore what the disaster had taken. What they pulled through instead was something that had never been intended for this universe. The fleet that emerged from the fold was unlike anything in the Federation's extensive archives of alien vessel classifications. 17 ships of extraordinary geometric complexity, curved, asymmetrical architectures that resembled crystalline organisms more than constructed vessels, held station in a formation that Federation tactical analysis would spend weeks trying to interpret. The largest vessel, positioned at the formation center, was nearly 4 kilometers in length, its surface alive with luminescent energy patterns that shifted and pulsed in rhythms that Starfleet's most senior xenobiologists would later describe as breathing. Running lights were the wrong word for what moved across those hulls. It was closer to thought, made visible. The psionic shockwave had preceded them through the fold by approximately 11 seconds. Enough time for it to radiate outward at a speed that defied conventional subspace propagation models, washing over every telepathic mind in range before a single sensor array could register the fleet's arrival. The Tal Shiar monitoring station at designation Vareth 7 recorded the event in its final 3 seconds of operation before the station's entire crew lost consciousness and the automated distress beacon activated. The beacon's signal reached the Federation border relay at Starbase 8619 minutes later. Admiral Catherine Janeway received the preliminary report while reviewing refugee resettlement logistics for the Romulan diaspora's third wave. She read it twice. Then she made 2 calls, one to Starfleet Command, and one to a private subspace frequency that very few people in the Federation knew existed. The second call reached Jean-Luc Picard aboard the La Serena, 3 hours out from a diplomatic consultation on Raritan 4. If you want to see more civilizations collide with the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character or species you'd want to see make the journey in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Picard studied the sensor composites Janeway had transmitted for a long moment before he spoke. The ship configurations meant nothing to him. No analog in Federation records, no whisper of them in the Romulan historical archives he'd spent the past 2 years consulting. But the psionic event signature was something else entirely. Starfleet's subspace resonance maps showed it propagating in a pattern that wasn't random interference. It was structured. Layered. It had the unmistakable architecture of language. They announced themselves, he said quietly, to no one in particular. Raffi Musica looked up from the tactical console. The wave knocked out every telepath within 40 light-years. That's announcing yourself the way a photon torpedo announces itself. No. Picard shook his head slowly. A weapon doesn't carry syntax. Whatever that signal was, it wasn't aggression. It was the equivalent of a very large door opening. He paused. The question is whether we have the wisdom to walk through it carefully. La Sirena came about on a new heading, and the stars reoriented around them. Somewhere ahead, 17 crystalline ships held their formation with the patient stillness of things that had existed long before humanity learned to walk upright, and the Alpha Quadrant held its breath. The first Starfleet vessel to reach visual range of the Protoss fleet was the USS Ellison, a Curiosity-class science vessel that had been conducting gravitational surveys 3 light-years from the emergence point when the psionic wave hit. Its Beta's science officer, Lieutenant Commander Voss, had been among those rendered unconscious. She woke 40 minutes later with a headache she would describe in her official report as the neurological equivalent of standing inside a warp core during ignition, and immediately demanded to return to her station. Captain Lova had the good sense to let her. What Voss sensed when the Ellison closed to within 200,000 kilometers of the Protoss formation was not hostility. It was scrutiny. The quality of attention being directed at her ship felt ancient and unhurried. The way a geologist examines a stone, acknowledging its existence without granting it particular importance. She reported this to Captain Lova with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly how alarming the information was. The fleet wasn't threatening them. It was studying them. And it had been doing so since before the Ellison arrived. They already know everything our sensors could tell them about us, Voss said. Possibly more. Picard arrived 40 minutes after the Ellison, with 2 Starfleet escort vessels holding a respectful distance behind La Sirena. He had spent the transit reviewing everything in the Federation database that bore even peripheral relevance to what he was approaching: psionic civilizations, crystalline entities, non-humanoid first contact protocols, the sparse and largely theoretical literature on interdimensional emergence events. None of it was adequate preparation. He knew that before he finished reading. Standard first contact protocol required an initial hailing sequence on all frequencies, followed by a universal translator attempt, followed by patient silence. Picard followed the procedure meticulously, broadcasting in 17 languages, including 3 extinct Romulan dialects he'd learned during his resettlement work. The universal translator cycled through its full analytical suite, attempting to map the structured psionic signal against every known linguistic framework in the Federation's archives. The response came not through the comm system but directly, a presence arriving in the minds of every person aboard La Sirena simultaneously, with the controlled precision of a surgeon's instrument. It was not painful. It was, in its way, extraordinarily courteous. The communication bypassed language entirely, depositing meaning directly into comprehension. We have examined your vessel. We have examined your minds. We understand what you are. The question before us is whether understanding obligates engagement. Picard didn't reach for the comm panel. He simply thought his response, trusting that whatever was listening would hear it. Understanding has always obligated engagement, in my experience. The alternative is a diminished universe for both parties. A silence followed, 7 seconds by the bridge chronometer, though everyone present would later report it feeling considerably longer. Then the largest vessel in the Protoss formation broke from its position and moved toward them, alone, with the unhurried confidence of something that had never in its existence needed to hurry. Aboard that vessel, in a chamber of luminescent crystal and cold blue light, a figure stood at a viewport that curved around him like a cupped hand. He was tall, nearly 2.5 meters. With a broad, angular skull that bore no eyes in any position a human would recognize, his perception of the universe operating through psionic sensitivity so refined that visual light was a redundancy he'd long since transcended. His armor was ceremonial in its complexity, photon gold and deep violet, etched with the histories of a civilization that had been ancient when Earth's continents were still migrating into their current configurations. His name, transliterated into a form human vocal anatomy could approximate, was Executor Solendes, and he had led fleets in conflicts that made the Dominion War look like a border skirmish. He regarded the small, fragile ship holding position before him with something that was not quite respect and not quite condescension. It occupied a precise middle ground that his species reserved for things that were young but not entirely without promise. Your spoken languages are inefficient, he communicated, the thought precise and without judgment. But your persistence is noted. We will permit dialogue. Understand that permission is not invitation, and dialogue is not alliance. Picard allowed himself the smallest of smiles. In 40 years of first contacts, he had never been granted conditional permission to speak by a being who had simultaneously read his medical history, his psychological profile, and, if Voss's assessment was accurate, probably his complete collected memories. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he wasn't frightened. He was fascinated. "Understood, Executor," he said aloud, because some habits were worth keeping. "My name is Jean-Luc Picard. I represent the United Federation of Planets. We have many questions. We are aware." A pause carried the weight of geological time. "We have considerably more." The dialogue that followed was unlike any first contact in Federation history, primarily because it was conducted simultaneously on two levels: the spoken exchange that Picard managed with careful diplomatic precision, and the deeper psionic conversation that Executor Celendis conducted with every mind aboard La Serena in parallel, cross-referencing responses against each other with an efficiency that made deception essentially impossible. Raffi figured this out approximately 6 minutes into the exchange, and stopped trying to maintain her tactical poker face. There was no point. Whatever Celendis was, he already knew she thought the whole situation was somewhere between extraordinary and terrifying, and he had filed that assessment away without comment. The Executor communicated in structured concepts rather than sentences, each thought arriving with subsidiary layers of context that the universal translator struggled to render linearly. Picard found himself increasingly abandoning the translator and working from direct comprehension, a cognitive adjustment that left him with a faint pressure behind his eyes but yielded considerably richer understanding. What emerged from 3 hours of careful exchange was a portrait of a civilization that reframed everything Picard thought he understood about the age of the universe's intelligent inhabitants. The Protoss had achieved spaceflight before Earth's dinosaurs achieved extinction. Their philosophical traditions predated the founding of the Vulcan High Command by 800,000 years. They had fought wars that reshaped star systems, survived genocidal campaigns by entities they called the Zerg, a description that made the Borg sound, comparatively, almost manageable, and had splintered into factions across generations of theological and philosophical dispute before arriving at an uneasy, ongoing reunification. They had not come to the Alpha Quadrant intentionally. The dimensional fold created by the Romulan temporal salvage device had been a gravitational anomaly their long-range scanners initially classified as a known phenomenon, a collapsed warp corridor. By the time their instruments recognized the truth, the fleet had already crossed the threshold. They were not lost. The Protoss did not permit themselves the vulnerability of being lost. But they were displaced, and displacement, for a civilization whose identity was rooted in the mastery of space and time, carried a particular philosophical sting. "You intend to return to your own universe," Picard said. It wasn't quite a question. Eventually. Celendis' response carried layers of contingency that the single word didn't capture. The fold requires time to stabilize for safe transit. During that interval, we will learn. Learning is never wasted. "And what have you learned so far?" The Executor was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone formulating a response, but the silence of someone deciding how honest to be. "That your Federation is younger than our oldest standing structures by a factor that your mathematics would find uncomfortable. That your Vulcan allies practice a form of mental discipline our scholars would find crude but earnest. That you personally—" And here something shifted in the quality of the communication, becoming briefly and unexpectedly direct. "Carry the neurological scarring of Borg assimilation, and that you have spent considerable effort ensuring it does not define you. This is not without interest." Picard absorbed that without visible reaction, though the effort cost him something. "And the other civilizations in this quadrant? The Klingon, the Romulans, the Borg themselves?" "The warrior culture to your galactic northwest is loud," Celendis communicated, and Picard was fairly certain the Protoss equivalent of dry amusement accompanied it. Their psionic output is primarily adrenaline and honor calculus. Earnest but narrow. The remnant empire to the east is fractured. We detect at least 4 distinct political factions operating in mutual distrust within what was apparently a single government. Strategically inefficient. Another pause. The entity you call the Borg we have already detected. They detected us simultaneously. This requires immediate strategic consideration. That pulled Picard forward in his seat. You've made contact with the Borg? No. We have been scanned by them. There is a distinction. Selendis's tone sharpened, the first truly martial quality Picard had detected in the exchange. In our experience, being scanned by a collective consciousness that consumes civilizations is not a preliminary to friendship. We are recalibrating our defensive posture accordingly. The implication settled over the bridge like a drop in atmospheric pressure. The Borg had detected a psionic network unlike anything in their assimilation records, a collective consciousness that operated on principles entirely different from their own hive architecture, housed in vessels of extraordinary technological sophistication. Picard had spent enough time understanding Borg threat assessment logic to know exactly how they would classify that combination. Irreplaceable. Immediately prioritized. He looked at the sensor display showing the 17 Protoss vessels holding their formation with perfect geometric patience, and he thought about Borg cubes calculating approach vectors somewhere beyond sensor range, and he understood that whatever diplomatic ground he established in the next several hours might determine whether the Alpha Quadrant survived the intersection of these two civilizations. Executor, he said carefully, I think we need to talk about what cooperation might look like, even among parties who are not yet allies. Selendis regarded him through the psionic connection with something that had evolved, fractionally, from scrutiny toward consideration. You are persistent, Jean-Luc Picard. Your civilization is young and frequently wrong. But you ask the correct questions. A pause that felt like a door opening a single careful inch. Continue. The Tal Shiar had not officially existed for several years. This was, of course, precisely what the Tal Shiar wanted everyone to believe. Operating under 3 different organizational designations within the fractured remnants of Romulan intelligence infrastructure, the network that had once been the most feared secret police in the quadrant had reconstituted itself in the chaos following the supernova with the particular resilience of institutions that had survived by making themselves indispensable to whoever held power this week. Legate Torvek. A title borrowed from Cardassian administrative tradition, because the Romulans who ran this particular cell had a dark sense of humor about empires that had collapsed before them, had been monitoring the dimensional fold event since the salvage team's distress beacon activated. He had 17 analysts working the sensor data before Starfleet's first response vessel reached the coordinates. What those analysts produced in 4 hours of frantic work was incomplete, partially speculative, and almost entirely accurate. The ships were not from this universe. Their technology incorporated crystalline energy matrices that had no analog in Federation, Romulan, Klingon, or Cardassian engineering traditions. The psionic event at emergence suggested a civilization with neurological capabilities that dwarfed anything the Vulcans or Betazoids had produced. And the temporal salvage device. His device, funded through 3 layers of deniable shell organizations, had apparently triggered their arrival. Torvek was a pragmatist above all other things. He did not spend time on guilt or alarm. He spent it on opportunity. The damaged Protoss scout vessel was the key. In the chaos of the dimensional transit, one of the smaller ships in the formation, a craft roughly equivalent to a Federation runabout in scale, though infinitely more sophisticated, had sustained structural damage when the fold's exit shockwave intersected with an unstable Romulan gravity well left over from the supernova's debris field. It had drifted from the main formation by 40,000 kilometers before its systems partially stabilized. The Protoss fleet had dispatched no recovery vessel, which Torvek's analysts interpreted as either supreme confidence in the craft's self-repair capabilities or deliberate abandonment of a compromised asset. Either way, It was sitting largely unattended in open space while the main fleet was occupied with Picard's diplomatic overtures. Torvik dispatched 2 modified warbirds. Running minimal power signatures, stripped of standard cloaking to avoid the psionic detection he correctly anticipated, to approach the damaged scout on a slow, oblique trajectory that sensor analysis suggested might fall below the Protoss fleet's active monitoring threshold. He was right about the cloaking. He was catastrophically wrong about the monitoring threshold. The first warbird had closed to within 8,000 kilometers of the scout vessel when it stopped. Not because of a command from the bridge. No command was issued. Every member of the crew simply stopped what they were doing simultaneously, sat down, and remained motionless for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The second warbird's crew experienced the same phenomenon 11 seconds later. Neither vessel was damaged. No weapons were fired. When the crews recovered, confused, mildly disoriented, and missing 4 minutes of memory, they found their navigation systems had been gently but unmistakably reset to a heading pointing directly back toward Romulan space. The message accompanying the navigation reset was not in any Romulan language. It arrived as a direct psionic impression, simple and unambiguous enough that every person aboard both vessels received it with perfect clarity regardless of their telepathic ability, or complete lack thereof. This was a courtesy. The next approach will not be. Torvik received the report aboard his command station and sat with it for a long time. His analysts were very quiet. One of them, a young woman who joined the organization 3 years ago with extraordinary promise, asked whether they should revise their operational approach. Comprehensively, Torvik said. But he did not abandon the objective. He simply refined it. If direct acquisition was impossible, then indirect leverage was the alternative. The Protoss had arrived through a device his organization had funded and deployed. That created a legal claim, thin, almost entirely fictional, but present, over the circumstances of their emergence. More importantly, it created a narrative. In the fractured political landscape of post-supernova Romulan politics, narrative was frequently more valuable than hardware. He began drafting communications to 3 separate Romulan political factions simultaneously, each presenting a different version of the same core argument. That the Protoss were here because of Romulan technology, and that Romulan interests therefore had a legitimate stake in whatever came next. He also sent a more carefully worded message to a Section 31 contact he'd cultivated over the preceding year. A relationship built on mutual cynicism and the shared understanding that official Federation policy and actual Federation behavior were not always the same document. Aboard La Serena, Picard's comm badge chimed with an urgent priority flag from Admiral Janeway. The message was brief. 2 unidentified Romulan vessels had been found drifting near the Protoss formation, crews conscious but disoriented, navigation systems reset. No shots fired. No damage sustained. Picard closed his eyes for a moment. Diplomacy, he reflected, was always most complicated when the parties you were negotiating between had already begun negotiating with each other in ways you hadn't sanctioned. He opened the channel to Executor Selendes. I understand there was an incident involving Romulan vessels. There was an educational interaction, Selendes replied, with the precise equanimity of someone who had not found the event particularly notable. We trust the lesson was received. I'd appreciate it if future educational interactions were coordinated with my office first. A pause. Then, with what Picard was increasingly certain was the Protoss version of wry acknowledgement, you are persistent, Jean-Luc Picard. The Klingon fleet arrived without announcement, which was entirely consistent with Klingon diplomatic tradition and entirely predictable to everyone who had been monitoring subspace communications since the emergence event. Chancellor Martok had received the sensor reports, reviewed the psionic event data, consulted with his senior warriors, and reached the conclusion that a civilization of this evident power required immediate and unambiguous assessment. In the Klingon framework, there was precisely one reliable method for assessing another civilization's worth. General Karoth commanded 9 vessels, a mixed force of Vorcha-class attack cruisers and the newer Com-class heavy warships that had entered service after the Dominion War, and he arrived at the edge of the Protoss formation sensor range with disruptors charged and a prepared challenge broadcast already loaded into the comm system. He was not reckless. He was, by Klingon standards, exercising considerable restraint by announcing himself at all rather than simply opening fire. The challenge broadcast was traditional in form, an acknowledgement of the stranger's evident power, a statement of Klingon identity and martial heritage, and an invitation to demonstrate worthiness through combat, not to the death, necessarily, but to the point of mutual understanding. Klingon had been conducting first contacts this way for centuries. It had produced some of the Empire's most durable alliances, including, eventually, the one with the Federation. Picard, monitoring the Klingon fleet's arrival on La Serena's sensors with the particular exhaustion of a man watching a situation he'd carefully constructed begin to develop additional complications, opened a channel to Karotha's flagship immediately. "General, I would strongly recommend a different approach. Ambassador Picard." Karotha's voice carried the warmth Klingon reserved for people they respected and intended to ignore. "With respect, the Empire does not require Federation guidance on how to introduce itself. With equal respect, General, the civilization you're challenging just incapacitated 2 Romulan warship crews through what appears to be direct psionic intervention without firing a single weapon." A brief silence. "Then they are worthy opponents." The channel closed. Picard looked at Raffi. Raffi looked at the sensor display. "He's going in," she said. He went in. What followed over the next 47 minutes became, in subsequent years, the subject of considerable discussion in Klingon warrior culture, not because it was a defeat, precisely, but because it was something the Klingon conceptual framework had no entirely adequate word for. Karotha's fleet advanced on the Protoss formation in standard attack configuration. The Protoss responded by deploying 6 vessels that separated from the main group with a fluid, unhurried precision that Klingon tactical analysis would later describe as the movement of beings who have not been surprised by a combat situation in several thousand years. The Dark Templar came first. They materialized from nothing, permanent cloaks that Klingon sensors registered as complete absences of data, voids in the sensor sweep where something should have been detectable and simply wasn't. And they moved through the space between the fleets with a silence that had nothing to do with the vacuum of space and everything to do with the quality of their presence. They did not approach the Klingon vessels aggressively. They approached them the way a master swordsman approaches a duel, measuring, reading, already 3 moves ahead. One Dark Templar, designated in Protoss records as Executor Class Nerzim Warrior Alarak, a name the Klingon would not learn until later, moved alongside Karotha's flagship at visual range, visible through the bridge viewport as a figure of absolute shadow trailing void energy like a cloak made of collapsed starlight. He was there for 11 seconds before Karotha's weapons officer managed to target him, and gone, simply, completely absent from sensors, 4 seconds before the disruptor fired. The shot went wide. The Templar reappeared on the other side of the ship. General Karoth, to his considerable credit, recognized what was happening before most of his tactical staff did. This was not an attack. It was a demonstration. The Protoss were not fighting them. They were showing them something. The specific and calibrated message that the Empire's most sophisticated combat vessels and its most experienced warriors were, in the current tactical equation, operating at a significant disadvantage, and that this disadvantage existed not because the Protoss had chosen to press it. Karoth ordered his fleet to hold position. In his 40 years of command, it was one of the more difficult orders he had given. The Dark Templar withdrew. The 6 Protoss vessels returned to formation with the same unhurried precision with which they had left. And then, unexpectedly, a single communication arrived on the Klingon command frequency, not through standard comm systems, but direct psionic transmission, rendered in Klingon because the Protoss had been listening to the Empire's communications since they arrived and their linguistic analysis required approximately 90 minutes to achieve working fluency. The message was brief and, in its way, impeccably respectful. your courage is genuine. Your warriors carry themselves with the bearing of those who have known real war. We have known war for longer than your civilization has existed. We do not say this to diminish you. We say it because the warriors we respect most are those who understand the difference between bravery and wisdom, and choose both. Karoth read the message twice. Then he did something that surprised his entire senior staff. He laughed, a genuine, full-throated Klingon laugh that resonated through the flagship's bridge. I have met gods who spoke with less dignity, he said. He opened the channel to La Serena. Ambassador Picard. Perhaps there is merit in your diplomatic approach after all. High praise, General, Picard replied, and meant it. Section 31 did not officially exist. This was, structurally, very similar to the situation with the Tal Shiar, except that Section 31 operated within the Federation, which meant it had access to considerably better resources and was held to considerably lower accountability. Its operative, in this particular situation, was a woman named Commodore Vina Oris, who did not use that name in any context where it might be recorded, and who had been embedded in Starfleet's scientific response team since 40 minutes after the emergence event was first flagged at command. She had been present at the initial sensor analysis. She had reviewed every frame of optical data captured by the Ellison. She had read Picard's preliminary diplomatic reports with the practiced attention of someone looking not for what was said but for what was carefully omitted. And she had identified, in the wreckage of the Romulan salvage operation near the Dimensional Fold's emergence point, a fragment of Protoss technology approximately the size of a shuttlecraft that had been sheared from the damaged scout vessel during its transit, and was currently drifting in a debris field with no apparent Protoss retrieval operation underway. The fragment was crystalline. A section of what appeared to be a power conduit or energy distribution matrix, still faintly active, its internal structures cycling through what Federation analysis tentatively identified as a psionic resonance pattern. Oris dispatched a stealth-configured runabout with 3 of her best technical analysts. The orders were simple: retrieve the fragment, begin preliminary analysis, do not inform Picard's office. The retrieval went smoothly. The preliminary analysis began smoothly. The third phase, the attempt to interface a Federation ODN tap with the fragment's active energy matrix in order to extract data, did not go smoothly at all. The psionic resonance pattern, it transpired, was not residual background activity. It was a monitoring signal. The fragment was, in the Protoss technological framework, still connected to the fleet's distributed awareness network, a passive thread of the Kala woven into every piece of Protoss material regardless of its physical separation from the main formation. When Oris's technician made contact with the matrix using a calibrated electromagnetic probe, the fragment registered the intrusion, classified it accurately as an unauthorized interface attempt, and broadcast its status to the executor with the completeness and efficiency of a system that had been designed by engineers who had a million years to think about security. Selendis interrupted his conversation with Picard mid-sentence. There is a matter requiring immediate address. The executor's communication carried, for the first time, an edge, not anger, precisely, but the quality of attention that precedes it. A component of our vessel, which we had identified as debris and chosen not to retrieve, is being actively interfaced by agents operating under your Federation's authority, but outside your diplomatic structure. Picard's expression didn't change, but the quality of stillness that descended over him was the particular stillness of a man exercising very precise self-control. Can you give me the location? The coordinates arrived in his mind before he finished the question. He looked at Raffi. She was already running the check. 3 seconds later. Classified runabout, registered to a research division that doesn't exist in the public Starfleet database. Currently located in the salvage debris field at Mark 227. Get me Admiral Janeway. The conversation that followed between Picard and Janeway was brief and conducted in the clipped, carefully neutral language that two people use when they are very angry and very professional in equal measure. Janeway confirmed she had not authorized the operation. She also confirmed, with the grim efficiency of someone who had spent enough years in command to recognize the signature of Section 31's involvement, that she knew exactly what she was looking at. The runabout was ordered to stand down immediately. The fragment was to be returned to its drift coordinates without further interference. Oris received the recall order and complied, because compliance was occasionally the most strategically sound response to an order you intended to eventually circumvent through other means. The fragment was replaced. The data her analysts had extracted in 12 minutes of active interface was limited but not negligible. Energy distribution patterns, partial schematics of a psionic relay architecture, 3 seconds of what appeared to be stored communication data in a format that would require months to decode. She transmitted the package to 2 separate secure archives before the runabout docked. Picard, once the immediate crisis was resolved, returned to Selendes with an apology that cost him something real. Diplomatic apologies were a routine tool of his profession. This one was not routine. The individuals responsible acted outside my knowledge and without authorization. It will not happen again. The executor received this for a long moment. You are not responsible for all actions taken by members of your civilization, Jean-Luc Picard. We understand this. We have had factions. A pause that carried centuries of complicated history in it. We understand factions very well. Another pause. However, be aware that we have now catalogued the electromagnetic signature of the vessel involved. If it approaches Protoss material again, the educational interaction will be considerably less gentle than the one your Romulan friends received. Understood, Picard said. There is a second matter. Selendes' communication shifted, the edge receding, replaced by something more complex. The Borg have dispatched vessels toward our position. Our long-range psionic mapping detected their course adjustment 11 of your minutes ago. They will reach sensor range in approximately 4 of your hours. We believe you should know this, Jean-Luc Picard. We are extending this information as what your culture would call a gesture of good faith. The briefest pause. Do not waste it. 4 hours and 17 minutes. That was how long Picard had to construct a response framework before the Borg arrived, and arrived was perhaps too gentle a word for what Borg cubes did when they had identified a target of extraordinary interest. They didn't arrive. They descended. 2 cubes. Long-range sensors confirmed the configuration when they crossed the threshold of reliable detection. Standard Borg tactical formation, weapons systems active, assimilation protocols engaged at the subsystem level, which meant the targeting and acquisition sequences had already begun before they were within firing range. This was not an exploratory contact. The Borg had assessed the Protoss psionic network during that first long-range scan, classified it as a collective consciousness of unknown architecture with potential for integration into the Hive framework, and dispatched accordingly. The communication that preceded them was characteristic in its brevity. We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Resistance is futile. Selendes received this through the same subspace channels the Borg used for all their announcements, and his response, shared simultaneously with Picard and with every member of his own fleet, carried the quality of someone who had been warned about a particular threat, had taken the warning seriously, and was now observing the threat manifest with the grim professional satisfaction of being correctly prepared. These are the entities you named as a primary concern, he communicated to Picard. It was not a question. A collective consciousness that consumes and integrates. We have encountered analogous threats. His thought carried a shadow of something vast and terrible. Not shared in detail, but present as context. The Zerg. Their assimilation methodology targets psionic networks specifically. Yes, Picard said. They've attempted to assimilate the Vulcan and Betazide peoples before. Both times, the results were catastrophic for the assimilation targets. They will find the Kala a more complex acquisition than they anticipate. Something steeled in Selendes' communication, a marshalling of focus. However, there is a concern you should understand immediately. The concern was this. The Kala, The psionic Gestalt network that linked all Kali Protoss in a continuous shared consciousness was simultaneously the civilization's greatest strength and its most profound vulnerability. It was a network. Networks could be infiltrated. The Borg, whose entire operational architecture was built around the infiltration and subversion of collective consciousness systems, had recognized this with the predatory clarity of organisms shaped by millions of assimilation cycles. Their approach was not targeting the Protoss fleet's weapon systems or hull integrity. Their approach was targeting the Kala's transmission frequencies. The first indication that the Borg strategy was more sophisticated than a standard assault came when 3 of the Protoss fleet's junior warriors simultaneously reported fragmented Kala signals, intrusive subharmonics overlaid on the network's baseline frequency, too structured to be interference, too alien to be internal. The Borg were attempting to inject a carrier signal into the Kala itself. If they succeeded, if even a fraction of the Kala network became temporarily synchronized with Borg frequency architecture, the cascade implications were almost too severe to calculate. Selendes moved through his vessel with a speed that his ceremonial armor made look improbable, issuing commands through the Kala in the compressed shorthand of a commander who had run this type of engagement before. The fleet reconfigured, void ray batteries rotating to target the cube's frequency emitters, High Templar taking positions at psionic amplification nodes throughout each vessel, prepared to generate the mental equivalent of a firewall. Picard, watching the tactical display with the particular alertness of someone who had survived Borg encounters by paying very close attention to details others missed, noticed something in the Borg approach vector that didn't fit standard assimilation protocol. "They're not targeting your weapon systems at all," he said. "No." Selendes' response was grim. "They are more intelligent than they appear. They understand that our greatest vulnerability is not our armor but our unity." A pause. "This is why the Nerazim will not be joining the defensive formation." Picard looked at his sensor display. The Dark Templar vessels, 4 of them, smaller and darker than their Kali counterparts, had already broken from the formation and disappeared from sensors entirely. Not just cloaked. Gone, in the way that void energy manipulation could make things gone, displaced into a space adjacent to normal existence that Federation sensor technology had no framework for detecting. The Borg cubes reached weapons range and opened fire. The Protoss fleet's photon shields flared gold-white, absorbing the first salvos with the efficiency of systems designed to handle energies on scales the Borg hadn't encountered before. Return fire from the void rays carved through one cube's outer infrastructure with a precision that Federation tactical analysis would later describe as surgical to a degree that implies the Protoss were not attempting to destroy the vessel, but to disable specific systems in a specific sequence. They were. Selendes was not trying to destroy the Borg cubes. He was trying to sever their frequency emitters before the carrier signal injection into the Kala could reach critical saturation. It was a race conducted simultaneously in physical space and in the architecture of consciousness. Plasma bolts and psionic firewalls and Borg nanoprobe signals and High Templar mental barriers, all intersecting in a combat environment that no Federation tactical doctrine had ever anticipated. Picard opened a channel to Selendes. "What do you need from us?" The executor's response was immediate, and given the circumstances, surprisingly specific. "Your vessel carries subspace communication equipment capable of generating a broad-spectrum electromagnetic pulse on frequencies 4.7 through 6.2 GHz. This will not harm us, and will degrade the Borg carrier signal's coherence by approximately 34%. Do this now." Raffi was already at the console. "That'll burn out our comm array." "Do it," Picard said. She did it. The La Serena's comm array went offline in a shower of conduit feedback that knocked out secondary systems on decks 2 through 4, and left the bridge briefly lit by emergency lighting. The broad-spectrum pulse radiated outward at the speed of light, and its effect on the Borg carrier signal was immediate and measurable. The injection attempt destabilized, the subharmonics fragmenting into incoherence before they could achieve the saturation threshold. In the Kala, 17 Protoss reported the intrusive signal collapsing. The High Templar at the amplification nodes held their positions for another 40 seconds before Selendis confirmed the threat had retreated. It had retreated. It had not been eliminated. The Borg adapted, as the Borg always adapted, recalibrating their frequency architecture with a speed that made the brief window of vulnerability feel almost deliberate. As though the cubes had accepted the setback as a data point rather than a defeat. The assault on the Kala's transmission frequencies resumed within minutes, now offset to a band that the La Serena's destroyed comm array could no longer affect. The Borg were, in their cold and patient way, learning. Selendis understood this. It was, he communicated to Picard, entirely consistent with what the Executor had anticipated. The carrier signal attack was never intended to be decisive on the first approach. It was a probe, a data-gathering exercise designed to map the Kala's defensive architecture before a more sophisticated intrusion attempt. The Borg were patient. They had assimilated civilizations that had defended themselves with more raw power than the entire Alpha Quadrant's combined military strength, and patience had served them better than force in almost every case. What the Borg had not yet encountered was the Nerazim. The 4 Dark Templar vessels had been gone from sensors for 18 minutes when they reappeared, not on any sensor display, but in the immediate vicinity of the lead Borg cube. They had navigated through the void dimension, that adjacent space that Dark Templar manipulation of negative energy could access, and emerged inside the cube's defensive perimeter without triggering a single proximity alert. The Borg sensor architecture, exquisitely calibrated to detect every known form of cloaking technology and subspace displacement, had no framework for registering a vessel that was not cloaked but was occupying a dimensional space that Federation physics hadn't officially confirmed existed. The Dark Templar did not target the cube's weapons systems or assimilation infrastructure. Alarak, working from a tactical assessment that had been developed over an hour of void space observation, targeted the frequency emitter array that was generating the Kala carrier signal. 3 void ray batteries on his vessel fired in a sequence so precisely timed that the interval between shots was measured in microseconds, each beam intersecting the emitter array at a different structural stress point. The array came apart in a cascade failure that the cube's automated repair systems immediately began addressing, but the repair process would take 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which the carrier signal assault on the Kala was completely suspended. Simultaneously, the other 3 Nerazim vessels targeted the second cube's primary assimilation processing cores, not to destroy them, but to force the cube to redirect its computational resources toward damage assessment, buying time and creating system load that the Borg's adaptive algorithms would need several minutes to redistribute. The combined effect was a 2-minute window in which the Borg's dual-pronged strategy was completely disrupted. 2 minutes is a very short time in most contexts. In a battle involving civilizations whose technologies operated at the speeds Protoss and Borg systems did, 2 minutes was a geological era. Selendis used those 2 minutes with the absolute precision of a commander who had been planning for exactly this window. The Kalai fleet's full photon armament focused on the lead cube's power distribution matrix, not the outer hull, which Borg regeneration could address in real time, but the internal lattice structure that routed power to the frequency emitters and assimilation systems simultaneously. The targeting data required a psionic link between 17 Protoss gunnery officers to achieve the necessary resolution. The sustained fire that resulted was something that subsequent Starfleet analysis would classify as operating in a fundamentally different category from anything in the Federation's weapons database. The lead cube's power distribution matrix failed in a contained cascade. The cube did not explode. It went dark, systems dropping offline in sequence as power routing collapsed inward, leaving a structure that was physically intact but operationally silent. The second cube, managing simultaneous damage to its assimilation cores and the reassertion of Kalai firepower now freed from dual targeting, began a tactical withdrawal. It was not a retreat in the Borg sense. The Borg did not retreat as a matter of pride. It was a reassessment. The collective had gathered enough data. The analysis would require time. They would return with adapted strategies. In the void between the departing cube and the Protoss fleet, Alarak's vessel materialized from the dimensional space it had occupied, trailing void energy in dissipating whirls of blue-black light. The Romulan commander whose ships had joined the flanking maneuver, a rogue element operating outside both Tal Shiar authorization and Federation diplomatic knowledge, transmitted a brief acknowledgement to the Nerazim vessel on an open frequency before withdrawing her own ships to a respectful distance. Her name was Commander Dila Tiarvel. She commanded 3 vessels that had once served the Romulan Star Navy and now served, depending on the week, whoever paid for their fuel and shared their particular conviction that the Quadrant's established powers were collectively too compromised to handle an emergency of this magnitude without help from people willing to operate outside the sanctioned frameworks. She had been monitoring the Protoss arrival since the emergence event, had made contact with the Nerazim through channels that bypassed both Picard and Torvik entirely, and had reached an operational understanding with Alarak based on nothing more formal than mutual recognition of competence. The Klingon, observing the battle's outcome from a holding position Karoth had maintained with exemplary strategic patience, transmitted a single communication to the Protoss fleet. It contained no words. It was the Klingon battle acknowledgement gesture, a specific calm signal that the Empire reserved for moments when an opponent's conduct in combat demanded recognition without the inadequacy of language. 41 minutes after the second cube's withdrawal, long-range sensors, Protoss psionic mapping, which extended considerably farther and resolved considerably more detail than Federation sensor arrays, detected the reassembled Borg response. Not 2 cubes this time. 6. Approaching in a formation that Selendis identified immediately as a psionic encirclement pattern. A geometric arrangement designed to create overlapping carrier signal coverage from multiple simultaneous angles, eliminating the directional vulnerabilities the Nerazim had exploited in the first engagement. The Borg had analyzed the battle in 40 minutes and produced a specific counter-strategy. The adaptation speed was, even by Protoss standards, impressive. Selendis convened the first multi-faction coordination the Alpha Quadrant had seen since the Dominion War. And even that comparison understated the improbability of what assembled in the shared communications space above the Protoss flagship's command center. Picard representing the Federation's official diplomatic presence. Karoth as tactical officer, transmitting from the Klingon fleet on standing authority from the general. Dila Tiarvel, whose participation Picard formally objected to and practically accepted, because the alternative was having 3 Romulan warships operating without coordination during a Borg assault. Alarak himself, present as the Nerazim's operational voice, communicating through Selendis as translator since his direct psionic transmission methods were calibrated for non-humanoid reception. 6 cubes in psionic encirclement formation. Selendis outline broadcasting the tactical maps simultaneously to all parties. Their primary objective remains the Kala. Their secondary objective is assimilation of our vessel complement. Their tertiary objective, a pause, appears to be the acquisition of your Starfleet officer, Jean-Luc Picard. Your neurological signature is flagged in their tactical data as a previously assimilated individual with knowledge of Federation defensive architecture. Picard absorbed this without visible reaction, which was becoming a practice skill during this engagement. What's your assessment of our combined defensive capability? Against 6 cubes employing an adapted encirclement strategy? Selendis' communication carried the honesty of someone who did not soften assessments for morale purposes. Favorable, but not without cost. The Nerazim can disrupt 2 or 3 of the encirclement nodes. The Kalai fleet can sustain fire sufficient to neutralize 2 cubes carrier emitters simultaneously. Your Klingon allies provide a useful kinetic pressure element on the formation's flanks. The variables are time and the Kala's resilience under sustained multi-directional signal assault. Another pause. If the engagement extends beyond 20 minutes, the Kala's defensive architecture will begin to show saturation stress. Individual warriors may begin to experience signal bleed, intrusive Borg frequency harmonics creating involuntary psionic overlap between Protoss consciousness and Borg hive signals. You're describing partial assimilation. Picard said. "We are describing what we must avoid by ending the engagement decisively before 20 minutes have elapsed." Selendis' communication shifted, an inward quality, reaching beyond the tactical calculation into something more fundamental. "Which is why I am authorizing a response we have not employed in this universe. The psionic storm." The silence that followed in the coordination space had the weight of people absorbing information whose full implications were still arriving. Karotha's tactical officer asked, with admirable directness, what a psionic storm was. Alarak's response, filtered through Selendis, was precise: a coordinated discharge of concentrated psionic energy from multiple high Templar and linked formation, capable of generating a cascading neural disruption field that affected both organic and electronic systems within its radius. Against Borg drones, it would create systemic disconnection from the hive mind. Against the cube's central processing nodes, which the Borg's collective consciousness used as distributed cognitive infrastructure, it would impose a disorientation cascade that would degrade tactical coordination for several critical minutes. The cost was this: the High Templar who anchored the storm would expend psionic energy at a rate that required significant recovery time. The Kala would be temporarily weakened precisely at the moment of maximum Borg pressure. And the radius of the storm was not precisely controllable. Anyone within the effect zone would experience its impact. Picard looked at the tactical map showing the 6 cubes' approach vectors. He looked at the distances. He did the calculation that Selendis had clearly already done. The encirclement formation puts 3 of the cubes within storm radius of our position. Yes. A moment of careful, deliberate communication. I will not compel the Federation's diplomatic vessel to remain within that radius, Jean-Luc Picard. The choice is yours. Picard thought, briefly, about the Enterprise. About Wolf 359. About the particular quality of the Borg's attention when they had previously decided he was worth keeping. He thought about what it had cost him, and what it would cost the people who would come after him if the Borg acquired a psionic network of Protoss sophistication and scale. He looked at Raffi, who was already looking at him with an expression that said she had done the same calculation and had the same answer. "We stay," he said. The Borg arrived. What followed was 19 minutes and 43 seconds of engagement that Starfleet's after-action analysis would spend years processing and never fully model. The Klingon fleet drove hard into the formation's flanks, disruptors running hot, buying the Nerazim the seconds they needed to transition into void space and reposition. The Kalai void rays worked the carrier emitters in rotation, forcing the Borg to constantly redirect repair resources. And in the center of the formation, 9 High Templar took positions in a geometric arrangement across 3 Protoss vessels, linked in a psionic chain that Selendis anchored personally, and began to build the storm. It gathered the way weather gathers, imperceptibly at first, then with the sudden, absolute commitment of a braking system. The psionic field registered on La Serena's instruments as every sensor simultaneously reading maximum values and then reading nothing, the instrument's frameworks inadequate to classify what was occurring. Raffi, who had no telepathic ability whatsoever, reported feeling a pressure behind her eyes and a brief, overwhelming impression of vast and ancient memory, not her own. The storm broke at minute 14. The 3 Borg cubes within its radius went simultaneously dark, their drone populations experiencing complete hive disconnection, their processing nodes struggling with a disorientation cascade that the Borg's adaptive architecture had no prior experience defending against. The Nerazim took the outer cube's emitters apart in the window the storm created. The Klingon drove through the collapsing formation with the focused ferocity of warriors who had been waiting for this exact moment. At minute 18, the Borg began withdrawal. All 6 cubes, damaged in varying degrees, falling back on courses that the Protoss psionic map confirmed were heading toward the nearest transwarp conduit. At minute 19, Selendis released the storm. 3 of the 9 High Templar lost consciousness immediately. 2 others would not recover their full psionic capacity for months. The executor himself stood in his command chamber with the careful stillness of a being managing a significant debt to his own limits, and said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke again, it was to Picard alone. The Kala held a pause. Your decision to remain was noted by every Protoss warrior in this fleet, Jean-Luc Picard. This also will be remembered. 3 days after the Borg withdrawal, the dimensional fold at the emergence coordinates showed signs of restabilization. Protoss temporal mapping, operating on principles that Federation science could observe but not yet replicate, confirmed that a stable transit window would open within 48 hours and remain viable for approximately 6 hours before the fold collapsed permanently. The Alpha Quadrant used those 3 days in the way civilizations use the aftermath of shared crisis. Processing, negotiating, arguing about what had happened, and positioning for what came next. Admiral Janeway arrived in person aboard the USS Aventine with a full diplomatic delegation and a very long list of questions. Karotha's fleet held station and his warriors exchanged increasingly elaborate combat stories with any Protoss who could be persuaded to communicate, which turned out to be more of them than expected. The Nerazim, in particular, seemed to find Klingon warrior culture interesting in the way scholars find ancient texts interesting, limited, but containing genuine insight. Commander Tiarvel's 3 ships were officially not present, which everyone acknowledged by not formally acknowledging them. Torvik's organization, operating from a position weakened by the failed probe retrieval and the subsequent Janeway-led audit of unauthorized operations in the region, filed 3 separate diplomatic claims regarding Romulan technological primacy in the emergence event and received 3 separate diplomatic non-responses. He was not surprised. He archived the claims for future use and focused on refining the decoded fragments from the 12-minute interface his analysts had managed before the recall. They would take months to fully interpret. He was a patient man. Section 31's Commodore Oris submitted her after-action report to an archive that officially did not receive it, recommending that the organization pursue 3 long-term research threads based on the Protoss engagement. She noted, with the professional detachment of someone who had long since made peace with the implications of her work, that the psionic storm's effect on Borg processing infrastructure represented the most significant tactical discovery against the collective since Hugh. She did not recommend sharing this finding with Admiral Janeway's office. She was overruled, eventually, by someone above her in a hierarchy that did not officially exist. Picard spent most of those 3 days in continued dialogue with Selendis, conversations that had evolved, gradually and without either party formally acknowledging the evolution, from conditional engagement to something approaching genuine exchange. They discussed the Prime Directive, which Selendis found philosophically coherent but strategically naive in its application to civilizations that had already achieved interstellar capability. They discussed the Kala and Picard's Borg experience with a specificity and mutual recognition that neither of them had found available with anyone else. They discussed what it meant to carry the weight of a civilization's ideals in a universe that did not always reward idealism. On the morning of the transit window's opening, Selendis requested a final formal communication, not psionic, but broadcast on open frequencies, in Federation standard, so that every vessel in the region could receive it. The request was unusual enough that Picard agreed to it without qualification. The executor's message was brief. It acknowledged the Federation's conduct during the emergency with a precision of language that made the acknowledgement feel substantive rather than ceremonial. It addressed the Klingon Empire's warriors by name, Karotha's among them, with a formality that the Klingon received with visible and audible satisfaction. It said nothing directly to the Romulan factions present, which was itself a statement they would spend considerable time interpreting. And it concluded with a statement that Starfleet's translation division would analyze for months, concluding finally that the closest Federation standard equivalent was something like, "We came here by accident. We do not leave by accident. What occurs between civilizations that have met cannot be unmade. Carry this responsibly." The Protoss fleet entered the restabilized fold in formation, the same geometric patience with which they had arrived, 17 crystalline vessels moving through a tear in dimensional space with the deliberate grace of beings who did not rush significant moments. The fold closed behind them with a subspace resonance that every telepath in range reported as a sound felt rather than heard, vast, structured, and briefly unbearably beautiful. La Serena held position until the fold's last readings fell below sensor threshold. Raffi stood at the viewport for a long time without saying anything, which was unusual enough that Picard noticed. "Thoughts?" he finally asked. "I'm thinking about what he said," she replied. "What occurs between civilizations that have met cannot be unmade." She paused. "I'm not sure if that's reassuring or terrifying." Picard considered the empty coordinates where 17 impossible ships had held station 3 days ago, and the Borg transwarp conduit their sensors had tracked to its closing 48 hours before, and the data fragments in a Section 31 archive he wasn't supposed to know existed, and the Klingon warriors who had come home with a story they would tell for generations, and the Romulan commander whose 3 ships had never officially been present. "In my experience," he said quietly, "it tends to be both." In the years that followed, the Protoss encounter would become one of the most consequential and least formally documented events in Federation history. The Borg's withdrawal after the psionic storm demonstrated a tactical vulnerability that Starfleet researchers pursued with quiet urgency. The Klingonerism exchange produced a philosophical dialogue between warrior cultures that neither had anticipated and both found genuinely enriching. Commander Tiarvel's unauthorized cooperation became the foundation of a back-channel relationship that proved valuable during subsequent crises. And Jean-Luc Picard carried a single addition to his understanding of the universe. The sense memory of 9 High Templar building a storm, and the feeling of something ancient and enormous choosing, deliberately, to share the risk. Somewhere beyond a dimensional fold that had closed and would perhaps never reopen, an executor filed a record of the engagement in the Protoss archives, a civilization old enough that the Alpha Quadrant's entire recorded history fit within a single archival index. The record noted that the young Federation had demonstrated qualities worth remembering. It noted that the collective called the Borg had encountered a psionic counter-architecture they would not easily solve. And it noted, in the compressed shorthand of Protoss' historical record, that the human called Picard had chosen to remain within the storm's radius. In Protoss culture, that notation carried a specific and significant weight. It was the designation reserved for warriors who understood that the defense of others required, sometimes, accepting that the cost would be personal. It was the designation, Entaro Adin. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.